Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about dynamic music systems. And I have an example here for you, but first we kind of have to define what a dynamic music system is. So in games, you're often dealing with constantly changing environments, different state variables kind of being thrown in, like with enemies coming in, or if the player moves to certain regions, or if cutscenes activate. And there are so many different elements that get thrown into these systems. So it can be really difficult to kind of pick and choose what music track we'll be playing depending on the input that we have in the current game state. So what I aimed to accomplish here was figuring out a way of managing all these different elements coming together. So this is one way that I approached it. And it's really important to note that there is no right or wrong way. And that's because all games are different, and all environments and game systems and how games are set up are different. So you really have to approach it depending on the needs of the project. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you kind of how I have this set up. And I know it doesn't look like much, but looks can be deceiving. So the important thing about this scene is the subsystem that takes place behind it, which is managing all these different variables to choose the music depending on what the needs of the game is at the time. So we needed a way to represent that, and that was done through these beautiful cubes and a little bit of lands and some purple squares, and you have a player in the middle here. And so this player is going to be experiencing different things in gameplay, and we're going to see kind of just how this scene reacts to it. By the way, if you are not sure what I'm using, this is Unity, and it's coupled with Wise, so they're both integrated together for this project. So let's do it. We're going to play, and the game should fire right up. And we don't actually need to use the game view for this because we're going to be manipulating it just through our beautiful regular tools. All right. So right now we have the player in the middle, and this first subsystem is state-based, which means that it's defined almost entirely by one thing being true and other things being not true. As you walk around, we have the regular default music playing right now. And first thing to note is that these purple regions represent areas in the game, or regions. You have forest, cave, if you look over on the left in this hierarchy. And you have triggers that trigger specific entry points that this person will experience. So we have a new area that we've entered. The first song will fade out and the second song will fade in. So it's pretty standard right now. Let's just wander around a little bit more. We're gonna go back to the main area. Let's cross over a little bit. We'll just test all the different regions. A little bit more somber over there. We keep going. Back here, we have another region. So, it's usually playing one track at a time, which is what the first subsystem is all about. Now we're going to start bringing in some other elements. So all these cubes, except for the black cube, I'll get into that, but all of these cubes represent enemies. So the green cube will have a level of 1. And you can kind of see some of the attributes we have here. So the enemy script, which is just custom made. And we have a tier of 1, okay? Next up, you have yellow, tier 2. This orangey brown, tier 3. And then this red one is tier 4. So let's see what happens when we drag an enemy in. Note that we're inside just the regular region right now. And we're gonna bring a guy in here. And it's worth noting that I'm using some songs from some of the Wise tutorials. So they are prepackaged sounds, and they may not necessarily represent the song that you want to play for these encounters, but they're just placeholders, and you can always change them out. So we have the green enemy that came in. We're gonna have a yellow. I'll just give you an idea of what they sound like. It's a very similar sound, but it's an octave lower. Different instrument. Now, you may have noted that as soon as an enemy comes into the area, which is kind of how it's defined, that the music will change. So that's not too difficult. Now, we need to figure out a way of prioritizing these music tracks, right? So this system that I made has a few specific goals in mind. On the lowest level of priority, you have region areas, okay? So if nothing else is being affected, it'll be playing a region. As soon as you add something that has a higher priority, like an enemy, it would go into the next level of priority. So we have regional priorities, and then we have enemy priorities. So enemies will come in and basically override the region. So the state will be changed, and if a higher tier enemy comes in, it'll override that track. All right, so even though the green tier 1 enemy is in range, the tier 3 enemy is overriding it. Now, let's say another tier 3 enemy comes in. Nothing happens because the state's already been defined for that specific enemy and that specific priority. Let's have a yellow enemy come in. Yellows are tier 2. So yellow comes in, and the music doesn't change. And that's because each enemy is ranked in priority. And I have an algorithm that calculates any given enemy's priority when they are in association with the player location. So they'll probably organize what track is supposed to be playing depending on that. So let's get rid of them. And I'll give you one more example of that, okay? And you'll notice that the state's back into the cave music. So we'll bring level 4 enemy in, and he has that same tambourine sound as level 3, but there's also some brass in there as well. Now we're going to bring all the enemies in, just to make sure that the ordering is still being performed properly. So nothing changes. Good. So let's just walk the player out of that area. And even though we've changed regions here, this enemy is still in range, so we're going to keep that priority. Now, one last note to make about this region, which is kind of interesting, is this desert region right here. And it doesn't look like much at first glance, just kind of like the system itself. But if we move the player in, we're playing music here, right? Yes, we are. All right. So we're going to move this player, and we're going to move him into the desert region. And just like the other states have been behaving, nothing really changes, okay? So it'll play the regular state music, but we're expecting that by now. But I did add one more interesting aspect to it. So we're just going to go to the trigger here. And I added a variable that says override music. And what that does is it gives it a higher priority than everything else, except for the black cube. But we'll get into that. Now here we are. You have all the enemies, you have the region tracks, and as I stated earlier, regions have the lowest priority, and as soon as you bring an enemy in, it would normally start playing music, but it doesn't, because we've given a higher priority to this region than the enemies. And the reason we would do something like that is in a quest region, or in any region essentially that you wanted to have a higher importance, because perhaps you want to focus on the ambiance of the region. And even if there are enemies inside that section, they are less important than the mood you want to describe with the actual playing track. So that's just a fun little extra feature I added in. Could be useful. You might use it, you might not. But we're going to go into the second subsystem. So we'll cancel out. Now let's talk about the second subsystem. The first subsystem is state-based, and the second subsystem is similar but different. So it still relies on regions to change state depending on the player's location. And the difference is that the monsters in this case will be state-based on a separate track. So I'm organizing the monsters differently to the regions, okay? And what this lets me do is play in synchronization region music and enemy music on top of it. It's important to note if when I talk about that tempo and harmonies and the key are usually similar. So it'll actually work when you switch to the different regions. It's not the case in every game, but it makes a really interesting feature when you want to do something like a vertical sequence. So we're going to go look at how that might function now. We're going to click play. And then I just added some behind the scenes features here where I can just press some keys and change the different subsystems kind of on demand. So as I do this, we are now entering the concurrent enemy and music subsystem. So we're going to go back to scene. Everything looks similar right now. We're going to just do that quick example. So we're going to go back. We're going to change states. Okay, so we're passing through. Now, let's say an enemy comes in. Let's go back to the usual spot here, okay? Now something interesting is happening. We have the original track playing for the region, but we also have a layer track on top of it. So using callbacks with Ys, I can double check when there's a sync bar to dictate when the next cue will come in for the second track that's going to be playing at the same time, which is awesome. Now, when we get to the monsters, they are still played by priority, okay? So we're going to do a tier 2 monster. There we go. So the music's changed. But as soon as the tier 3 monster comes in, we still have 2 layers. The monster subsystem chooses its track to play, and the region subsystem chooses its track to play. So they're kind of working in combination with each other, which is cool. Now, let's see what happens. Zoom in a little here. Make sure we have these selected. Get rid of that. Let's see what happens when we change regions while the music is all synced up. So we still manage to maintain the sync there. When it changes regions, the program will handle the region change by fading out all the tracks and bringing them in sync. It's definitely just an extra consideration that kind of has to go in behind the scenes. And now we move on to the third system. So the first system was state-based. The second system was based on concurrent music tracks playing between enemies and regions. And the third system is additive. So it's a combination of all those, but with a more extreme level of vertical sequencing. And what I mean by that is instead of having the enemies prioritize based on the tier of the enemy, we're going to have the region track playing. We're going to have the tracks of any enemies in the vicinity of the player, and they're all going to be synced together, and they're all going to be added together. So we come up with a more complex orchestral piece as it plays. And it gets really interesting as you move into the different regions because it all starts changing around and gives it kind of a fresh feel. We're going to load up the game. We're going to press key 2, which is additive. Now, everything looks the same, just like the other 2 times. Now we're going to move a friend in. And it won't start until we get to a proper cue point. This was just to make sure that we were getting synchronization properly. So we're going to do a track entry. There we go. Okay. So we're going to start moving guys in. All right, it's doing pretty well here. Coming up with some interesting music tracks. And finally, we're going to cue this guy in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, awesome. Now we'll see how it works when we move things around, because region changes can obviously affect synchronization as the song fades in and out, kind of without being on beat. And we've handled all that in the system. So they're all going to fade out. They're all going to come in to the new music. Let's get back out. We'll move some of these guys away. So even if the tracks in this example aren't harmonizing perfectly, we still have our proof of concept. All right, so it's all additive. Now we're just gonna play around with it a little to make sure we're testing out different scenarios. Change regions again, everything's still in sync, which is one of the primary goals here. So that's awesome. Now, we talked about the subsystem where this is a trigger, and that overrides music. And if we wanted to, we could add code to still simulate that. But in this case, since the state isn't competing for dominance in the music and choosing what music gets to be played, we're not really worrying about the ambience atmosphere. Like I said, it could be changed. That's just how it's set up in this program. But every music system is different. So there you go. There's one more feature that I'd like to go into really quickly, and that's this black box over here. Now this represents cutscenes, which is an override for every single music track in every single subsystem, okay? It's not just for cutscenes, I should mention. It's for anything that you want to override. Let's say there's a specific sound that you have to have played without the distraction of the other music tracks. So what you would do is you would create this. You would have an override script, for example. This is just how I did it. You would put in the event that gets to be overrided. It's going to override the other events, rather. And you activate it. So that's now activated. And in a game, it wouldn't really look like a cube. It would just be a variable that says to override. Or it might be just a trigger on something, right? For a cutscene, for menu sound, a specific game complete sound, etc. Like, it really doesn't matter. It's just important to have something like that in there to prioritize that over everything else being played. So there you go. That is essentially this music system. It seems very simple in this kind of context because there's not much set up in the scene, but it is extremely scalable